Good afternoon. The time is 1:05 p.m. I'm reconvening this meeting of the California Citizens Redistricting Commission. I'm Chair Connie Galambos-Molloy, and to my left is Commissioner Jody Filkins-Weber, who will be serving as Vice Chair. We'll be picking up this afternoon, continuing on the report backs from our advisory committee meeting. Actually, could I have it noted for the record that all commissioners are present minus Commissioners Ward and Parvenu. Thank you. So we will be moving into the Outreach Advisory Committee report back, which we started on yesterday afternoon. I think where we left off in the conversation, there were a couple of action items that we are hoping to resolve within the next hour or hour and a half regarding the calendar and regarding commissioner participation in the various stages of the work that we'll be doing, again, these three outreach phases. Some questions had come up around content and overall strategy regarding the educational workshops, which would be, again, our phase one. So with that, I will pass it back to Commissioner Ontai to lead this part of the discussion.
Mahalo. Aloha kakahiaka, everybody. How are you?
How are you?
And the same to you.
And the same to you. I want you guys all to start doing that, too, in your own languages. Okay, so I think what we wanted to cover today was clearly going over some of the scope again, because there were some questions. Another issue was the calendar dates and how we can fix it, so to speak, so that it's more responsive to commissioners' personal agendas or just efficiency itself. And I want to suffice to say that CCP, Sarah and Charlotte, both are here. There they are perfectly willing to adjust the schedule that you saw in those months to what the Commission feels would be a better schedule. So I just want to point that out right off the bat, that we can have a discussion on that, because I know a number of commissioners have some great ideas. We wanted to start off someplace, so that's why you have a map. But without a map, we can't really finalize it until we get the full Commission's response to that. So that's number two. I think we need to discuss that. And then the third important issue is that we need to go over their contract. I know there were a number of questions on what the scope is, and so I'm hoping to clarify that with our consultants here. And if there's anything else, we can talk about it. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's pull out our calendars. Now, as you know, we had grouped these community outreach hearings into two categories.
Please note for the record, Commissioner Parvenu has joined us.
Educational workshops and community input hearings. The distinction being the input hearings are basically the mapping process, and the educational workshops are essentially educating people who, for the first time, are not used to or haven't heard what redistricting is all about. So it's more of a grassroots attempt to reach down to ordinary citizens. I think one of the questions that we had discussed, even as a subcommittee, was the educational process can actually continue throughout this whole process. So where do we stop that line? Because, as Doug mentioned in his presentation, once we release the trial maps, there's probably going to be a lot of people responding that have never heard of redistricting before, but they're going to be coming forward and they're going to say, you can't split my neighborhood like that. We need to know more what's going on. So that's going to happen, and I think Doug gave some good examples of that happening in Arizona. So I think that's a piece that we need to discuss too, whether the educational workshop should continue as part of the input hearing process, or what formula that should take, should occur right now. Now, in the schedule that we gave you, July and August show no meeting dates, and we left that purposely open because this discussion will help us shape that. Does that make sense? So shall I just open it up to the commission and have your input on calendar dates and how we can fix this?
Commissioner DiGiulio and then Commissioner Dye.
Can I just throw something out maybe as an option for a starting point of discussion? I think based on part of the what we heard from Mr. Johnson this morning in terms of us needing to maybe look at a tighter schedule, and also I know we have discussed the educational component. I'm wondering, I have 2 points. One is I'm wondering if the educational component, if we spend some money in doing a video, if that's something that we can send out prior to arrival for input and still try and get in a lot of encouragement, but to do, even though it's not optimal, I'm suggesting that we might remove the educational workshop components and to instead go focus on the input meetings. And along with that, I would also like to suggest another consideration for the way we've mapped these out is that instead of, I know there's probably some rationale methodology for doing them all on the weekends, but I think it might be better if we look at a regional, a larger geographic area and shoot for a Thursday to Monday or a Friday to Monday schedule where all commissioners could come. Maybe we start in Reading, we go down to on one day, Sacramento the next, maybe the Bay Area, something that's regionally possible, and it would mean that the commissioners would be on the road for like 4 days in a row to do inputs, but then you could do a big grouping of input together, maybe take a week off to digest it, maybe not, maybe we do the same thing in another area, but I'm wondering if there's some options to do some groupings and then move to another section and keep within the regional model and hit those areas. But I think we as commissioners, it's going to be hard if we're going up to the north on a Saturday, then we fly down, then we have the week off, and then the next weekend we're doing this. I think it would be a better use of our time is to condense them into a group and then move on to another grouping. Those are the two suggestions I have in terms of the workshops and the actual input hearings.
Thank you. Please note for the record, Commissioner Ward has joined us, and Commissioner Dye.
Thank you. First of all, I just want to second those suggestions. I think I mentioned this in Claremont that I questioned the need for us to invest the amount of energy into educational workshops, given that we have modern technology. I could see the rationale for maybe doing one of them, videotaping it, putting it on YouTube, stamping out some DVDs, sending it out to all of our partner organizations and letting them, and our office distribute them as needed. I completely agree with Commissioner Antai that the need for education will continue through the process and, in fact, may snowball toward the end as people are looking at actual maps, and then all of a sudden they want to get involved. I know there's been a lot of pressure to try to do something in March, but given what's happening with the contracting, I just don't see how that's going to happen. And then if you look at the numbers in the budget, as I'm sure you've all looked at now, I mean, we have over $100,000 right now for educational workshops, and we could save a lot of money by using technology for that.
Commissioner Forbes.
Thank you. Yes, I was going to make the same comment. It seems to me, particularly what we heard this morning, it seems to me that a couple things. One, the education workshops, well, I asked him, Arizona did not have education workshops. They just didn't have them. It seems to me that we, as has been suggested, that we can make a DVD, put it on a variety of sources, make it available to the public at large. We could put it on perhaps local television stations. I mean, there's a variety of outlets we could use that, first-rate DVD that we would make that people could use. The other thing is that, and then we could have an educational component in every input meeting. We could start out the first 10 or 15 minutes saying, we're really glad you're here. We're looking for your input. Here are some ways you can, that would be best for us, for you to give us that input. So it would be part of the ongoing process. But also, I think another thing, and this is following up a little bit on what Commissioner Dye was saying, based upon the attendance figures that we were proposed, when you get 10 people to show up at the educational thing, and the amount of money it costs, it seems to not be a very cost-effective use of the money, that we could get a much more cost-effective use out of it by using these other outlet sources. So I'm inclined personally to, I don't know how it affects the schedule. I don't have any opinion on that at this point. But I think that I think that we should considering the education meetings becoming input meetings whenever they in fact occur.
I'll put myself in the stack. Another consideration, thinking now as a member of the Finance and Administration Committee, is around timing and the fact that, essentially this expenditure will need to be made before we have any hard data on what it's looking like in terms of our budget augmentation. And given that the education is important, but it's actually not the bottom line deliverable that we were charged with in terms of the maps, it could put us in a difficult position later as having restricted some of our cash early on that then we wouldn't have available for the actual input hearings. Other commissioners? Commissioner Baraba?
Yeah, I thought this morning's conversation was valuable in the sense that he brought forward the notion of when people would be most interested in what we're doing. And obviously they'd be more interested when there's alternatives that they could actually see. And we're clearly in no position to do that at these earlier meetings. So that was an insight that I hadn't quite thought about as far as creating the kind of dialogue that you wanted, which was instead of it's all coming from us out to them, we wanted to have more reason for engagement. And I think if we had something to, not one thing to show them, but some things to show them, I think that might improve the dialogue that takes place.
Commissioner Blanco?
I agree. It was instructive, and in looking at, for me, I'm looking at the finances, and I think it's actually more than what Commissioner Dye. I'm looking at the budget. I think when you add up all the items, it's more than. So maybe somebody. I want to hold the floor, but can somebody clarify exactly what the cost of the educational outreach meetings will be when we put it all together? What's the bottom line?
Sarah?
Do you want to turn to page 7?
Yeah, I'm there.
Oh, okay. So for 9 workshops, $103,955.76 at the bottom.
I think the question is more than that. There's staff time, there's commission travel time, and so on. That
Right.
Sorry.
Yeah,
I
the total. Yeah.
I don't.
Do we know what it?
Commissioner Ontai or Mr. Claypool?
Mr. Claypool, maybe we can answer that.
I'd have to take some time. We simply didn't divide it that way. Would you like me to go ahead and start working on that right now?
I think it's clear it's more than this.
It's just
That's just the CCP cost.
illustrative of my point, which is that you've got the actual contract, and then we have all our time, equipment, et cetera, and that was in one of the. So we're actually talking about more than $100,000 with this effort, and so I think the closer we're getting to understanding the task ahead of us in terms of the expertise we're going to have to buy for some of the statisticians, et cetera, which I think we're beginning to really now get that this is both, we knew that, and then the presentation today, that this expert piece of the map drawing and perhaps as was described earlier, that you will have 2 people drawing, you might have people working on congressional maps, and I'm thinking that part of our costs are probably underestimated in our budget, all the expert technical costs, and I'm concerned about not having that money because we, as you mentioned, Commissioner, we expend this up front, and then we have to deal with the fact that maybe we don't have an augmentation in the amount that we need, and then we're hand-strapped on the technical expertise side. So that and the calendar, and I think that we are really in a sort of a different era in terms of education and what people, how you reach out to people. And I would like to see us think about the notion of videos, DVDs, things that actually will get to more than 10 people, and perhaps put money into thinking creatively about the dissemination of those. That might cost money. But the production of that, and then you could potentially reach many, many people, might be a more effective way to do that in combination with the communication strategy, which is if there's a newspaper article, if you get us on TV, etc., that also is educational outreach. This is what we're doing. This is what we do. This is who we are. This is who you voted in to do this job, etc. So I'm feeling the same about this.
Commissioner Parvenu?
No, I definitely concur with what my previous colleagues and previous commissioners and colleagues have stated. It looks like we have $16,128,000 for preparation, $103,955 for the conducting the workshops, and the conference call and webinar educational workshops, whether we want to keep that in or not, is $1,712. But overall, I want to say I appreciate the good work that CCP has put into this overall plan, but we're in an age, and I agree with what was stated before, we're in an age where national regime has been overthrown, in Egypt and another in Tunisia over Facebook. And, we have to, Egypt has, 80 million? We have about 38 million here in California. We can certainly get more bang for the buck if we utilize those multimedia sources. Although I appreciate the strategic plan that was put in place, I concur with Commissioner Yao and Blanca and DeJulio and everyone else who stated that the logistics and moving us around and just all of the other unseen costs here, I'm reluctant to have us move forward with physically having a physical presence at the workshops. I think the video approach is far better.
Mm-hmm. Commissioner Baraba?
Yes, and having in the seat where our two guests are today, I hope, I want you to know we appreciate that we gave you a different direction than what we're currently giving you right now, and that I think you replied quite well to what we originally discussed with you, but that we did come up with some new information that I think has changed our mind, and I just want you to know that it has no reflection on you.
No. Commissioner Dye?
Yes. In fact, I was hoping Mr. Wilcox would talk a little bit about some of the thoughts that we had for broadcast media in particular, because I know there's been some concern that, certainly we want to use Facebook, YouTube, on our own website, but in addition to non-internet vehicles, that we already have some stuff kind of in place for if we have this a well-produced video that we could get distribution.
Before Mr. Wilcox makes the presentation, I would love to hear, as you're making the presentation, where you see staff's role in disseminating that, and where we might still need to utilize CCP, because I think we all agree that we like the idea of technology, but it's going to do no good if it sits there, whether it'll be a staff that does it or if we still ask CCP to help us with that dissemination.
Yeah, and also let me add on to that. We're still going to need somebody, whether it's CCP or not, to organize the logistics. I mean, that's a huge task.
Commissioners?
I'm sorry, to organize what? I didn't hear what you said.
To organize the meetings itself, to make announcements. At this venue, we're going to have this event.
Right, but if we're talking about replacing in-person meetings with a video, then it's not clear that that's going to be the same.
No, I was referring to whenever we have input meetings.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Commissioners Aguirre, Yao, and then Parvenu.
Yes, it was a very revealing kind of information this morning. As far as educational workshop is concerned, I know that we've talked with CCP about developing a toolkit that would include a video. I would say that in order to do that well, and anticipating that perhaps we will not be able to deliver educational workshops in the presented format, that we really invest in doing a very good outreach in that area. So perhaps some of the funds that were previously allocated to the actual on-site presentations, workshops, that we look at maybe investing a little bit more into that outreach phase. The other thing is that some of the folks that we were anticipating were going to bring people to the table at each one of these sites were these groups that are out there throughout California on the ground. Some of those we're going to be hearing from tomorrow. And I'm not sure whether they have the full picture of what the Commission is willing or where the Commission is in terms of expectations. So I'm not sure whether they have that yet or not. If they don't, then CCP could probably help us with that. And if not, really delivering educational workshops to the general community, work with this more quote-unquote professional group of organizations so that they know exactly what information to impart to their constituents so that they're better prepared for these input sessions. As far as the input sessions are concerned, the model that was presented by CCP includes pre-hearing sessions. In other words, the hearing starts at 6, CCP starts at 4, working with individuals as they arrive, talking to them about, educating them about, what's going to occur at the input session. And then the other piece is really handling the input session itself. Whereas, let's say we have 150 people that are lined up. Number 150 might be 6 hours into the input hearing. So there needs to be a process for organizing the order of speakers, making sure that they understand what we're looking for, making sure that the information that they're going to be presented is in a format that's kind of acceptable to us or understandable by us. So they have kind of like a role within the model that was presented, where a role in not only the pre-hearings, but also during the sessions themselves, organizing the mass, so to speak, so that it's organized and it's efficient, and that some of the questions that might be coming up before us could be handled by them even before they, get to the presentation. So,
Thank you,
anyway.
Commissioner. No, I hear and I appreciate that feedback. As what I'm hearing from the commissioners is not questions regarding the value of CCP's role as we move into the input hearings, but really around the whole approach of how we deal with the educational component of our 3 phases. So Commissioner Yao and then Parvenu are in the stack, but before that, Mr. Wilcox was going to chime in as per Commissioner Dai's request around some of our broadcast strategies.
Yes, and I can even go into more detail during my report, but part of the free media as far as utilizing the kinds of interview shows, the news programs, radio, and the ability to be able that they're interested in this subject. Already, just as an example, this week, Commissioner Dye and Commissioner Forbes each did a separate interview for Comcast, and it's headline news, and it's 4.5 minutes. It's not public access. It's on the headline news, and then at the end, there's a 5-minute break, 4.5 minutes long, a 4.5-minute long interview. And as you know, for television, and when you're looking at sometimes you're interviewed for a news program, and in the piece you get 18 seconds. Well, here the commissioners had 4.5 minutes and did a great job about laying out who is the commission, what is the commission supposed to be doing, what is going to be the outreach, what is going to be the input process. It was all laid out. If you're sitting at home and you watch that 4.5 minutes, you're pretty well educated on the redistricting process and what the commission is doing. So we're going to be doing a lot of those efforts and also not just in broadcast and talking about the print media, because as it's been mentioned several times, it's not just all about the internet. and you can reach millions and millions of people through these other avenues, through free, unpaid media. And of course, as was discussed earlier about now having videos produced and taking those virally, but those can also be used in conjunction with television and broadcast. Sometimes if you have an interview and they just want to take a snippet of that, or there's other opportunities to actually view those, have those videos used. So,
Thank you. Commissioner Yao?
You know, so far we've been talking about a very small segment of this CCP proposal, which is the delivery of the education workshop. What I would encourage the commissioners to do before we get away from this topic is perhaps approve the design of the education process, and then work together with Rob and others to come up with a alternate delivery solution, but not try to walk away from it and start all over again, because I think this package really is a very good package in terms of designing of the package, and the delivery of it is the only portion that we're questioning.
Commissioner Parvenu?
I echo what Commissioner Yao has just said. It's an excellent package, and I appreciate the work that you all put into this. In light of what was shared with us this morning, in terms of the input meetings, I absolutely see CCP playing a critical role in that aspect of this schedule. And perhaps, and I'll echo what Commissioner Forrest and Barabbas said also, if we could restructure the agendas or the daily schedule for the input meetings to include that educational aspect, and followed by an input, public hearing type format for an input, and then a period of questions and answers, or however we want to arrange it. We could turn these input hearings into a multifaceted event and still stay within 3 hours or 4 hours, and receive the input on top of the education for those who are new to the process. Throughout the remaining, we're looking at June and July prior to the release of the final map in August or late July. So that's my recommendation. I don't know if you were able to hear that this morning, because you were probably en route, but that's, I think we all concur that we want to include both education and input with these so-called input meetings that we have here.
Commissioner Filkins-Weber, then Commissioner DiGiulio, and Commissioner Aguirre.
Just for the record, I have taken due consideration of some of the additional expertise that we heard this morning from Mr. Johnson, and looking at the cost and really balancing those that are going to show up versus the expense for the educational workshops. I do feel, again, just would like to reiterate that the Commission should have some part in education. I think doing so before an input hearing would be helpful. But my question also goes to Mr. Wilcox. In the manner in which you have outlined your potential strategy and broadcast strategy, do you have a calendar, a timeline that you've thought about when, if we, for instance, consider taking out the March workshops, as it sounds as if some of the Commission members might be suggesting, do you have a timeline for broadcast launch, and maybe could we use March to do that? Have you thought about putting together a calendar for your broadcast strategy?
Well, in viewing, I've talked about maybe the media strategy in general, which includes newspapers and radio and TV, and building around 30 identified newspaper editorial boards, which will begin in March. I'm starting to book them right now. In fact, you will all be hearing from me because you're all going to be making visits. We'll probably have 2 commissioners per editorial board. And in fact, the first one was just booked that it's going to be this Wednesday, and it's the Sacramento Bee. And that we're also identifying not just the mainstream general interest media, but also the ethnic media. And then along with those visits is that you can we can also do radio and TV in those areas. Just for instance, when Commissioner Forbes goes to in Northern California and reaches in Reading, when he's there to talk to the Reading Searchlight newspaper, there's television and there's radio there. So we have that opportunity. I see this as also when we're talking about rolling out this strategy, it's important to also have events built around it as well. The editorial board is a good example, but also when you're having your your input meetings, that is when you're going to have the height of interest by journalism. And as I see that, when we're having our input meetings, that is an excellent opportunity to go in before and launch in this area, because that's when you want them engaged. And you don't want them engaged too far out, and you don't want to publicize something too far out that they forget, and that you want to have that rolling, during the week of. So you want to have that built in to get people to that input hearing, and then you also want to have the coverage of that input hearing so that those that were not there can also see the process.
Commissioner DiGiulio and then Commissioner Aguirre.
I think to follow up along those same lines, could I make a possible suggestion that because there are elements in this proposal that I think we will probably go forward with toolkits and others, but there are also elements in terms of, I think we all agree we want an educational component, and how that's delivered, where it's delivered, and in what form will be part of our staff's responsibility, but I would see we could also utilize CCP. So I'm wondering if, similar to what we've done in the past, can there be a liaison between the Public Information Technical Committee and Outreach? I don't know if that's my thinking behind that is that I'm sure staff will be collaborating, but I think it would be helpful for commissioners to be involved with this, because I think there'll be some elements, especially around scheduling, where the Public Information Advisory Committee needs to be in touch with the outreach. So I'd like to suggest that at least two of those commissioners collaborate.
Regarding that process suggestion, I think that's a good one. At the same time, I am hearing kind of two different directions we could take with the proposal as we have it. And one school of thought is suggesting that we adopt it as a package, and there's another school of thought saying that on the educational workshop piece that we might want to rethink our strategy or scale that part back or wrap that educational component completely into the input session. So I just wanted to clarify, those are the two things I'm hearing from the commissioners at this point. Commissioner Parvenu. I'm sorry, Commissioner Aguirre.
I said before, you're very gracious in passing it on. But anyway, perhaps given the information that we've been discussing, perhaps we could ask CCP to talk about what they might consider in the absence of actual educational workshops, what elements within their plan they might consider to still be valuable and deliverable. So, the toolkit being one, for example.
I have two commissioners over here on my right, Commissioner Baraba and then Commissioner Ward.
Yes, are we on some kind of a time deadline on getting something approved so that we can get a contract signed on this one, or do we have? So we don't. There's no timeline that we need to approve something at this meeting.
So my sense on that is not in the same way for some of the other issues that we're considering, but in order to actually allow the committee to do its work and CCP to do its work, we do need to make some decisions on just basic framework and methodology.
Okay, because we don't want to get into another, as we sometimes do, then find ourselves not with the ability to implement.
Yeah. Commissioner Ward.
Thank you, Chair. I was just agreeing with Commissioner Geary. I was just interested in hearing CCP's thought, given that we all have had some new input and seeing the direction that the Commission sees conducting the educational process, not just what in your plan do you still plan to offer, but what do you see being useful? Do you have a new vision that you could offer on how to integrate this kind of thing?
A vision in the last 5 minutes. Given that this is all new information to us in the last 5 minutes, where should we start? I think what might be helpful, you're going to make the choice that you think is right for you. And you're trying to gather as much information as you can to make the smartest choice. So if we realized that Mr. Johnson was presenting this morning, we would have been here. It would have been really helpful for us to also hear that presentation. I'm just almost wondering if this is just so coming out of nowhere. I wonder if we could have a 5-minute or even a 3-minute break to confer, to be articulate in our response.
How do we say no to that? Please take that. Please take that break. I think there are potentially other things that we can continue talking about. Maybe the issue of commissioner participation in the input hearings, or some of the other items.
Yeah.
We're going to
So while they're
Okay. Thank you. We'll see you shortly. Commissioner Raya.
May I suggest that we provide them, if they don't already have one, with a copy of this morning's presentation?
Yes. And just, I mean, that's a large presentation. I know you guys can talk, but there were a couple of points in there that particularly popped out to the commission. One regarding the likelihood that the numbers of participants we get in that first phase of educational meetings is going to be a fraction of what it will be later on in the process.
I would strongly disagree with that, but I just want a second to be able to tell you why.
That would be great. So we'll talk to you more in about 5 minutes. Commissioner Ontai.
Oh, well, they're gone. This is a very organic process. We still need, while they're thinking about this, the question of how we as individual commissioners are going to interface with whatever strategy or rhythm we establish between now and July or August. There still remains a question of how much time we're going to commit ourselves. And then there's a question of, from Monday to Sunday, what would be the appropriate days to set aside for community input meetings, and what would be appropriate days to set aside for business meetings. Business meetings at that point would probably mean the business of understanding input data and perhaps getting our consultants back to look at and asking them questions. I would think those would be business meetings. So I think we need to structure a typical Monday to Sunday and how that would work beginning in April as a starter.
Commissioner Fulkins-Weber.
I agreed with Commissioner Dye's suggestion that we have a business meeting in that same area where we're going to consider the input, because we'll all be traveling to that area rather than making, as we have lately, for convenience, Sacramento the prime place for a business meeting. I think it's an effective use of everyone's time to consider that the business meetings would correlate with this in the same location as the input hearings, since we'll all be there for the same general purpose. But as far as days go, again, I think we've reiterated the necessary consideration for the public, evenings and weekends. And if we did our business meetings during the day, held the input at night or on the weekends, that might be a good, effective use of time.
Commissioner Ontai, let me ask a question before we transition to Commissioner Ward. Yao, does your committee have a recommendation regarding how you would visualize that week playing out, that calendar week?
We had some thinking along this line based on our last month and a half. It appears that everyone's schedule, collectively, we have independent retired people, we have business people, and family people. The rhythm seems to be that Monday, Tuesdays are off limits. But I don't know for sure if that could be changed. Beginning Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, they're solidly we're making that commitment. That appears to be the pattern that's emerging. Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays. So that's how we arrived at Saturdays and Sundays as the outreach meetings. Now, we haven't talked about evening meetings during the weekdays, and that's possible. So that's the extent of it.
Okay. Thank you. Commissioner Yao.
If we divide California into two, whether you're in Northern California, Southern California, it's all within driving distance from any spot to any other spot in that north-south region. It may be a couple hours drive, but you can make it. So my concept is simply combine instead of just calling it general business meeting, let me just call it map drawing business meeting as compared to the input meeting. In the same block of time, if we say, okay, we want to work from Wednesday through Sunday, then let's go ahead and block off that week so that whole week would either be in Northern California or in Southern California. Or if we want to divide it up into 3 regions and maybe in mid-California and try to take care of the transportation, the logistic and issues in that manner. Driving in the evening from point A to point B, as long as it's within reasonable driving distance, I don't think it's going to be an issue. And staying at different hotels every night, well, that's so be it. But I think doing it that way, we can satisfy both the necessity of meeting as a whole group and also the desire of meeting as a whole group in the outreach. The public input sessions that we're proposing.
Commissioner DiGiulio.
I think that one of the important things we have to keep in mind here is the issue of time and the best utilization of our time. I think that's why we are saying there may be some element. I think CCP may have some other ideas about the educational workshops, about attendance, but I think the reality is we're saying out because of time. And we also realize that the first phase isn't where we're going to get as much input, though I think that's where we touch base. But it's time, and time is going to dictate that we will compress our business meetings with our input meetings. Time will dictate that we have to just put a block together. I know we've been trying to work with our schedules, but we all just need to say, put it on the calendar. Throw your pens down. Make a stand. But, take Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, whatever it is, put it on the calendar. It is up to us to arrange our schedule, I think, at this point. And I don't think we do a little here and a little there. I say you have to cram it. I mean, really, that's where time is our issue. That's my impassioned plea.
Yeah, and I also think that I actually think evening meetings probably work better for most people. I think a lot of people are very reluctant to give up their weekends. So if we start having all of them on Saturdays, I think that, that might suppress the kind of response that we would like. So I also think that taking a regional approach, which I think we've all agreed to, is also better from a communication standpoint in terms of getting the media coverage.
Commissioner Forbes.
Yes, just as a follow-up on the scheduling, and this is a retailer's task as well. Is when can you schedule things when people will come? And Sunday afternoon is the time you schedule things, because Saturday soccer, you can't compete with it. And so I think it behooves us to have at least one of our meetings, input meetings, on Sunday afternoon, perhaps Sunday evening, but Sunday is not as good. And I do think the idea is that, I think we ought to show up. It ought to be a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, or Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, way of splitting, because I think you're going to get better attendance on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday than you would on Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And I do agree that I think we just have to schedule them, and whoever will be there will be there.
Commissioner Blanco.
I agree. I don't think this should be around our schedules. I think this has to be around the schedule, especially the input meetings, have to be around the schedule of the people from whom we are seeking input. And that should be our major consideration And it seems to me that we've made some analysis of that. Some analysis of that was included, I think, in what you sent us. It wasn't just based on our schedules. It was, if I remember, when we asked questions about the methodology, it was in this region people said they preferred these nights. So I think that should be our guiding principle, is where we're going to, what's convenient for the people from whom we're seeking input. So and that might mean weekends. And then I really agree that we just have to, I would advocate that we do everything as, if that means 3 days in a row, that means 3 days in a row for us. And the last thing is that I think that if we, going back to sort of, that this is not just either a cost or attendance issue with the educational workshops, but going back to our overall calendar, these dates that were proposed for the educational could quickly become, some of them could become input dates.
Without our tech.
Well, I mean, we do have to talk, absolutely. But we might be able to move some stuff up, and that way we get to this point that we talked about earlier where it's good to have something to then throw out. So we go out and have something earlier rather than later that people react to.
Can I add on to that? And that was raised as an interesting point. If we did some type of artistic mapping, what did that piece say? Modern art or whatever. Not as a final map, but just to throw something on the wall and see what kind of response we get may generate more interest along with the educational piece as early as March.
Commissioner Baraba.
I thought about that this morning, and I would suggest that we have more than one map. Because if we come into one map, somebody's going to say, that's the map. And then we're going to be criticized for putting out the wrong map. If we had a couple, at least two maps, then we could, these are not the map. These are ideas, and we would like your reaction to these ideas.
Yeah.
Mr. Claypool.
I just took the time to go back and talk with Mr. Johnson, and I was just curious. It was a question I meant to ask in front of when he was here, but there were so many questions. But I asked him, how much time can this commission expect to have to put in when we really start seeing maps, when you're approving maps? And he said because of the way the 14-day time period works, that you can expect to have 1 to 2 weeks of needing to be together 5 days a week. And then you'll have time off, but time off in between where you'll still have to meet, possibly to have input and so forth. But you are going to have large blocks of time, or you're going to have weeks, particularly as we get into the middle of this process and as quickly as we can start seeing maps, where you're going to have to be putting together 10 full days with only a couple of days off in between, if you're going to stay with this process. And that was his opinion, and I just wanted to interject that.
So it get worse.
But you're talking towards it when we're finalizing the maps.
He actually said that once you start seeing maps and you're directing your line drawers and your staff, we'll start having to notice that period because we have that 14 days. But then when you get them back and you're reviewing them, he says that it would be 1 to 2 weeks, at least a solid block of 5 days as you go through all the maps and all the changes, and then possibly a second week of that, depending on how quickly you go through the maps. And certainly there's going to be a learning curve, and you're going to accelerate your ability to review these maps. Having said that, however, I think when you have your first maps, you're going to start seeing large blocks of your time where you're going to really have to consider your personal schedules versus the schedule of the commission in order to meet your deadline.
Could I ask a question? If Mr. Johnson is here, would it be helpful for our group if we had an idea as a as one thought? Are we looking at a 1/3? If we remove educational workshops and we went to the first phase of the input, and then we're looking at the review of those, what are you thinking in terms of a 1/3, 2/3 split in terms of scheduling our time? Something less, more? Would that be helpful for the commission to have some sense?
Sure. Mr. Johnson.
It's hard to say. I'm guessing, and probably the CCP people might have a better sense of this, but I'm guessing you probably want to do the same number of input meetings that you have now. You would just start them a couple weeks earlier, and then
Yeah, I guess in
finish
terms
earlier.
of like not a number of meetings, but in the time frame in which we do it, condensed into if we had 12 weeks, would you recommend the first part only be 4 weeks, and then 8 weeks for the real nitty gritty when they have something to look at?
As a general rule of thumb, that might make sense, but I think you probably want to look at it in terms of where do you really have to have your input hearings, because you do have to kind of cover the state for that.
So driven by the location.
Yeah, and they would be better to tell you what's the logistics of actually getting them organized.
Commissioners Parvenu, then Filkins-Weber. Thank you, Mr. Johnson.
Turning our attention to page 13 of the draft schedule that CCP has presented to us. We're nearly in the month of March. It begins next Tuesday. I assume that we will be meeting, well, I know that we'll be meeting on the 9th, 10th, and 11th as a full commission.
No.
We're not? Okay, well, that eliminates that theory. Because I was thinking that in lieu of having an educational workshop on the 12th, and that was not determined in concrete, well, assuming if we are to meet as a full commission on the 23rd, 24th, and 25th, this schedule which says that the 26th there is to be an educational workshop as proposed in the LA region, perhaps a prototypical input/business/public hearing, that one meeting wrapped up in one, a trial run perhaps could be tested on a day of our choosing, following a full business, 2 or 3 day business meeting in the month of March, which would indeed move that date up. It would give us enough time to publish it, and then as we meet on other days. I guess the point I'm making here is that if our recommendation is to combine the meetings, input meetings, to have a few trial runs prior to see how they work, if we are to recommend that we, in lieu of having a full educational workshop, go towards an input meeting, or that, whatever we want to call it, business, input, public hearing, whatever it's called, that we move it up and try having at least an initial run at some point very soon. Because I agree, time is of the essence, and we need to have some type of prototypical or some type of demonstration to see how the mechanics of this activity flows. So that's my comment or suggestion for feedback from the Commission.
Commissioner Filkins-Weber, and then Commissioner Aguirre, and then I'd like to transition back to our guests from CCP.
I certainly do not want this to be a circumstance where we reiterate everything we've already discussed, but we're back to where we started before. I understand that time is of the essence, and what is now being suggested, at least from 3 commissioners and even Mr. Johnson, is to up the input schedule. But what you're talking about is a circumstance where we're going to be holding input hearings without our technical expert. So it has been suggested we can do that because then the technical expert can go back through the transcripts and get all of the data. But again, we already discussed this and we said that's not going to be practical. So what we're looking at is alternative solutions at this point for what we're going to do in March. But I don't see that it's going to be practical for us to consider moving up any input hearings when we're not likely to have a technical expert until April 1st. So just keep in mind we've had this discussion before, but we've got this underlying contract issue, and we're going to have to make some decisions on that. We've already went through that yesterday as well. So keep in mind that at the earliest at this point, if everything worked out smoothly, you know, we may, minus a protest, be able to get a technical expert on board April 1st. So keep that in mind during the time in which you're discussing moving things around.
And that was going to be my point, too.
Thank you. So at this point, I would like to transition back to CCP, now that you've had a chance to confer.
Well, first of all, thank you for letting us take the 5-minute break to get our heads around it. We're a little, just needed a minute to get our thoughts together, and I think we do now, so thank you. I just wanted to reiterate a couple of things and just so that we're all on the same page. And that's to go back to the objectives of the workshop and the educational phase. And I don't want to say that we're disagreement over that you have to hold the workshops or the format of them, but I want you to be clear about what you could possibly be giving up. And we should be thinking intentionally and thoughtfully about ways that we can innovatively possibly still reach folks. And so I just want to be clear and be thinking about it. So I saw Mr. Johnson's numbers, and I guess I'd like to propose a reframe of that. So for his numbers, it was basically that people are going to get more interested as the process moves along and as maps come out, and I completely agree with him. So the objective of the workshop was to bring people out in the beginning, get them involved in the process, add some transparency. It was also to build some advocacy. So if a group comes out and gets to meet with a commissioner and gets educational information, they start to build trust in the process and in what you're doing. They feel like you're going out to the communities, you're listening to them, you're starting to build those relationships and that network. And that's going to be really important, and that's something that you will want to do, whether you're doing workshops in this format or in some other format. But you'll want to be building those networks. The other thing is, so if we use the 10-person comes to a workshop model, in our experience, and the real goal was that, yes, those 10 people came to the workshop, but the way that we were trying to set it up was that they were going to go back to their communities and talk to 10 more people. For example, we were trying to reach those grass tops so that they could reach into their communities and do some self-organizing, right? So just remember that kind of model that we were talking about. And did you want to?
Yeah. So the idea with the toolkit that we've been talking about from the beginning is that's the piece that someone could take away and go back and self-organize. And the reason that we had talked about 3 weeks between an educational workshop and an input hearing is the idea is you want to get people revved up and excited that they can make a difference so they have time to go back, organize more people, and come to the input hearing and provide you input that is articulate, concise, effective. It's set up in the way that your technical person can take it in, and then you can use it at the time that you need it. So I think, yeah, let's talk together about what your goals are, so that we can think about how to innovatively still be reaching people and still educate people. I think a toolkit is still the way to go. I think trying to get people, getting it out in lots of different ways is something we should be doing no matter what. But I think the thing we need to think about is that lost trust piece, or how do you now create the mechanism for the exponential, for people to go back and build those networks exponentially when you give up the workshop.
And in our framework, we did, as Commissioner Gary pointed out, a couple of different mechanisms for getting this out. There was the video idea and the conference call webinar idea and the pre-hearing session. So I think that we do have some. We've already thought of some components to try and to touch people in different, using different avenues and mechanisms. So I think some more thought to that. And I do agree, and I understand the position you are all in. If you were to scale something back, I understand why we were always trying to think of how else could we, have the least amount of workshops and, how could we fill in some gaps. So I understand, I'm not too surprised, but I guess I just want to be clear about the trade-offs and thinking about how we can still reach people. And the other thing is the workshops, it's the hard to reach people. You want to get past the usual suspects, or the people that are already engaged. They're engaged and they're going to continue to be engaged, and you want to make sure to reach past those people.
Commissioner Baraba?
Yes, I think earlier it was mentioned the possibility of doing one of these outreach meetings and to do a good job of videoing it and making sure that it's run and getting all the points we wanted to get across and a dialogue between participants. And then that may be one way of keeping the spirit of what you had in mind, but then we would use technology to spread it rather than a series of meetings.
Commissioner Dye.
Yeah, I mean, I think no one is against the idea of doing education or putting a toolkit together. I think it's absolutely necessary. We're just thinking of the most cost-effective way to reach the most people, and I would posit that the hard-to-reach folks are the least likely to actually perhaps come to a workshop. I mean, they're much more likely to see it on Chinese TV or something like that. I mean, that is something that we're going to get out to a lot of people for very low cost.
Commissioner Forbes.
I don't think it would work to videotape one of our meetings. I mean, you're talking about 4 or 5 hours. I mean, I don't think someone's going to watch that. I think we have to make a targeted DVD of some length, and I'll let the people who do these things determine what that length ought to be. My question is that a service that you could provide to generate a DVD?
Yeah, we have it in our proposal.
Oh, I know. I didn't know if you actually are the production people, though.
We have a vendor that we've talked to, and
Okay.
that model that we've talked about is 4 modules. So if you pull them up, if you're on the web, you could just click on one if you wanted. They would have different titles. They'd be 7 to 10 minutes each, so that you don't have a lot of uploading, buffering issues when you're watching them. And then the thing we've talked about is having the first one that's kind of the introduction be part of what could be viewed as people walk into the pre-workshop education piece. But that was before this morning. That was
Yeah, and we could maybe step that up. And other things I know that what I did on census when we didn't have a lot of resources either, is we made, in this proposal we were talking, this is just something off the top of my head, but in this proposal it's one toolkit. And I know that something we did with census was we had really targeted resource guides, something for elected officials that was specifically for them and how they could reach out. So you might be able to do some things at a lower cost to develop more targeted materials and do some more outreach to get those to the right folks.
Because I was just thinking if you could generate a single DVD of some length, the appropriate length, that could be distributed through to local TV stations, to a whole variety of outlets, as well as the internet and so forth and so on, and then have it done in several languages. So it would be available in Spanish and Chinese and so forth and so on, so we could play it in a variety of venues. Could be an inexpensive way of getting the information out. I think Commissioner Dye's comment that the hard-to-reach clientele are the least likely to come to a meeting.
Commissioner Aguirre.
Yes, and I would concur with Mr. Forbes' comments that I mentioned earlier that if absent the actual site-based educational workshops, that we should invest more in the outreach part through what we're talking about right now. So I know we struggled with the issue of translation, and certainly there's 2 aspects to that. One is input hearings, in this case, what's going to be input hearing translations. But then on the outreach piece, I think that we really should invest in videos that target ethnic and racial groups throughout in their own particular languages, including Native American, and that they should and that we should also invest in the toolkit and some very good materials, because ultimately part of what the grass tops mean is that we're going beyond the Maldives and Aleos, the Asian, political caucus. We're going beyond that to really the leaders in local communities. And with the census effort, they went to elected officials as being those leaders and others in community-based organizations. And they, as an elected official, I got a toolkit that I went to this group that I work with, Poder Popular, and really talked about, what we were trying to do with the census. And in fact, that group went and mobilized others. So I think there's real value to the educational concept. But I think that it's incumbent on us to really invest in doing the best that we can if we go without the educational workshops, certainly.
This discussion is very rich, and I have 2 commissioners here in the stack, Dye and then Raya. What I'd like to do is to draw the commissioners' attention back to a couple of the action items that we were hoping to land on for this agenda report back. And one was to adopt the calendar or some version of it in principle. and to adjust the scope. So I think if at this point of the conversation we can begin to focus on what adjustments we would like to see in the calendar and in the scope of work, that would really allow our consultants and our committee and Mr. Wilcox to take the next steps they need to take. Commissioner Dye and then Raya.
So with that in mind, so I would like to propose that we not do these educational workshops and that we spend the time in March and have, I would suggest that Mr. Wilcox work very closely with CCP, because that's where the content's going to come from, on what should be in this toolkit to investigate what the options are in terms of a short video, that can be distributed on YouTube, Facebook, and made into a DVD and distributed on cable television, et cetera, including language options, and use this time to come up with a high-quality product that can be widely and broadly distributed. That would be my suggestion on the educational workshop piece. I think I'll turn it over to Commissioner Raya.
And can I ask a clarifying question? Are you putting it on the floor as a motion or just an idea for consideration at this point?
Shall I put it on the floor as a motion?
Oh, let's have further discussion first.
Wait, just wait.
Okay, Commissioner Raya.
Because I'm not really speaking exactly to that. But in our Public Information Committee, we talked about the use that we can make of all of us, all the commissioners, in getting our message out. And I, myself, always viewed this educational component as generating interest, getting just more like letting people know. I didn't see so much the takeaway part of it. But maybe that's just, kind of cynical me thinking, wow, that's a pretty tall order to really get a huge takeaway on it. But if we're talking about videos and we're talking about multilingual versions of it or something, it seems to me that we could blend, the opportunity to bring particular commissioners into that message that's going to go out. We have, 4 or 5 languages, I think, at least on the commission, and they're major languages. So, I just think that's an opportunity to put the personal face on it, to really make it, this is who's doing the job, not an actor doing a video or something.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just my
That's
thought.
a great idea, yeah.
Thank you. Other commissioners? Again, I'd love to entertain concrete suggestions on the calendar and the scope.
Yeah, let me suggest another scoping issue. I would suggest that we go forward with the March 12th educational workshop and have that filmed, videotaped as our first piece that we can actually base it on an actual community event and see how that we can package that, working with Rob, so that we have at least one video or CD that has a community event workshop. And we can't do that by ourselves. That actually has to happen.
I would agree. I think we should probably do it later in March, though, and have one big event, and then use that, if we were to take this approach, use that as the model, so you'd have your good toolkit ready.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah, have one, and then make sure, actually use footage from a event would be.
And get testimonials at the same time. Ask people, get them involved, ordinary grassroots, top leaders. What do you think about this event? I think that's very important.
Mr. Claypool, then Commissioner Dye, then Commissioner Anchetta.
I just had a question, and I see that the conversation from this morning has clearly driven us to this idea that we need to start more quickly. And as we're doing that, we're starting to separate ourselves away from the idea of doing these outreach processes. I'm thinking part of it is because of expense. But I'm wondering if we're not possibly losing sight of the fact that we're taking away the meetings that we would have been having during that period of time when we won't have a technical advisor. And so it gives us, it kind of eliminates this ability of ours, if for nothing else, to show that we're moving forward to perfect a product. And one of the products that I think we might be able to perfect with moving forward with some of the outreach meetings while we're waiting is our ability to have our consultants work with individuals and get whatever takeaway we're going to get the public's belief that we are moving forward, and start into the process of meeting with groups so that we can take input and then immediately transition into input meetings as soon as we get that technical advisor aboard. I'm just wondering if that might not be a useful component to this argument, as well as moving forward with the things that you're talking about with our executive director. And it's just an idea.
Commissioner Dye?
Yeah, so I had a couple comments. I'm not opposed to doing one meeting. I do agree if we do it, it should be later. I think that Rob has big plans for us, which you'll hear in the Public Information Committee report. So I don't think anyone should be worried that nothing's going to be happening in March. I mean, we're all going to be really busy in March, and we're going to be out and talking to newspapers and being interviewed. There is going to be a lot of activity, so I don't think that we need to be worried that we're not moving forward and that people will think we're sitting around on our asses for a month. That's not going to be happening. So, I just think that, we want to take the time to do this well. My concern about using, one of these meetings, I just want to go back to Commissioner Forbes' comment, videotaping a 3-hour meeting is not going to serve our needs for this video. We need something that's, 5 minutes or less that grabs you, that gets the key points across, and probably directs people to the toolkit on our website where they can download information that's really concrete.
Commissioner Anchetta?
Thank you. Before I raise this point, just a point of clarification. I asked yesterday if we were, and I think we had included sort of the statewide hearings and workshops. Or, is that sort of going to be a separate discussion, or can I just fold that in now?
You can bring it in now.
Okay. So, I generally go with the tenor of the discussion that multiple workshops are not really essential, particularly given other efforts that have been happening for several months throughout the state. And I agree that some other media, including various video options, are probably the better way to go, given timing and expenses. One point I would raise, and this goes to the question of the sort of the statewide drawers, those who are compiling larger maps, whether statewide or regional, and many of whom are drawing on similar types of input workshops that they've already been doing, actually, over the last few months, that we have something that allows us to, one, have some technical workshop or some sort of very clear training, because those are advanced drawers. I mean, let's be honest. We have a different audience here, and I fully understand the need to educate the general public, but we also have, given what's evolved over the last several months, we have a number of groups, and again, they're not certainly going to represent everybody's perspectives, but there are groups that are compiling things in a certain way to produce regional and state maps. And I think we have to understand that we're going to get those maps in some form down the line, and we should be working closely with them to let them know what we want in those maps, and that to the extent they're already doing some work with other various communities that which are sort of encompassing a number of the groups we're trying to cover, that those leadership groups or advocacy groups, however you want to label them, that they have a very clear understanding, and this is maybe a much more technical kind of workshop, and a very much more technical sort of input hearing, that's built into the schedule too. Because again, there's a lot of overlap here, and a lot of materials that have been developed are quite good. Again, they're not the only thing you certainly want to point to, but I don't want to reinvent the wheel, particularly when it comes to sort of workshop presentations in that sense.
Commissioner Forbes.
Yes, well, I would actually not agree with that. I don't want to give a leg up to groups that are viewed as groups that have a particular point of view. I'd like them to come in the queue with everybody else, ordinary citizens. I think we want to be very cautious about being perceived as giving an advantage to those groups as opposed to the citizens. Regarding the schedule, I think that we should consider beginning in April blocking out Saturday, Sunday, Monday of every week Then we'll include that would be the outreach meetings, not the outreach meetings, wrong term, input meetings, and our business meetings. And we should just schedule that beginning in April and go for it. March I'm leaving open because I think that's still is sort of soft, but I mean, just as a concrete proposal.
Commissioner Anchetta.
And I'm not trying to favor anybody, but and this is not exclusively these groups. We know there are certain groups, and you're right, I don't want to give any advantage to anybody in particular. You're absolutely right. But the reality is, if someone's going to give us a statewide map, we need to look at that. We have to spend more time looking at that. We can't spend 5 minutes in a public comment period in the same way we might ask a general member of the public who's giving us a neighborhood or community of interest. And I think we do have to track that separately, because it's just in terms of gathering information, we have different audiences and different types of presentations that are going to come forward. I don't think it's feasible to treat them all equally in that. So I'm very sensitive to what you're saying in terms of not giving anybody an advantage or giving them a leg up over others. But again, the reality is we're going to get different kinds of information. We have to be able to, I think, be flexible in accommodating all the different sources and make sure that we're able to actually get and use that information.
So I've heard some really great ideas about how we might, and I'm going to take them one at a time, regarding the calendar, which we are attempting to adopt some version of in principle. None of these ideas have been stated in form of a motion, so I want to encourage, if we're getting close, for someone to...
Okay, I'm going to make a motion that beginning in April, that we schedule our business meetings and our input meetings for consecutive weekends of Saturday, Sunday, Monday. Okay. Okay, we'll ask and add Tuesday as well.
Saturday, Sunday,
Monday, and Tuesday.
I will second that motion.
Commissioner Yao seconded the motion, but could I have you read back the motion for us, please?
That the Commission, beginning in April, schedule business meetings and input meetings for Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday.
The floor is open for discussion. Commissioner Ward.
Thank you. I'm just wondering if there would be friction with making that Thursday, Friday, or Saturday, Sunday, only because per prior agreements, those of us with businesses had previously set Monday and Tuesday as the only 2 days, aside, and everything else open. And now we're switching that. I'm wondering if there's a big difference if we move it to Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, as opposed to Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday.
Personally, I think there. Can I respond? I'm sorry.
Yes, please respond.
I'm sorry. I think there is a difference. I think Friday night is an ineffective time to have a meeting. I mean, I just practically speaking, and then much of Saturday is also not available. And so I think you really are knocking out a good block of your time. Where I think you have a more effective time if we have a business meeting like on Saturday, and then have input meeting Saturday afternoon or Sunday. But
I have commissioners in the stack. I do want to ask a quick question to CCP, given that you've facilitated these different types of processes before. This question around which days of the week and which times of those days. Could you please weigh in on that?
As we have talked about before, I'm sorry, I can't remember if it was yesterday or the day before. Ideally, what I would recommend is that if you could leave us some flexibility to connect with the region or the community or the place that you're interested in having your workshop in, and go, you're going to be looking for low or no cost locations ideally. So you don't know the availability of those low or no cost spots. We've been talking about places that they need to be ADA accessible. They need to be able to accommodate 200 people. We ideally, with the format we're talking about, we're going to want a separate space for the pre-hearing educational piece that's different from your place where you're taking your official testimony. We've heard community groups talk about how important it is that you've got to have parking and you've got to be accessible to public transit. So given those parameters, to limit yourself right off the bat to a certain number of days of the week before you've gotten to connect, I would say you're just hamstringing yourself. And if you had a lot of time, it'd be one thing, but you have a very compressed time schedule.
Commissioner Filkins-Weber.
That's what my question was. I believe you had mentioned it yesterday. Isn't there a possibility that different regions will respond differently to different days? Is that correct? You had mentioned some survey. Okay. And that's, I think we are hamstringing ourselves because we're not really discussing necessarily region or what the region's response would be if these were appropriate days, when in actuality a given location might very well find Wednesday, Thursdays to be more beneficial to them, so it may not be conducive for us to lock ourselves into as much as we want to schedule. I really understand that and appreciate it, but we've really got to be appreciative of the regions that we're going to.
To follow up on Commissioner Filkins-Weber's comment about the regions, while you were out of the room, I think we did have some synergy around the fact we need to group our input hearings around regions. So I think the way the calendar is currently structured, we have, a meeting here, a meeting there, but for example, there might be a 4-day stretch where we're going from the Inland Empire down to San Diego, then over to Los Angeles. So I wanted to make sure that you knew that ASAP. Commissioner Parvenu?
Okay. With all due respect, I have to disagree with Commissioner Forbes' proposal, or motion rather, for personal reasons. That's from shifting from our previously established Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday schedule to a Saturday, Sunday, and Monday schedule. I'm involved within my church activities on Sunday, and I'm also, as an urban planner, we have standing public hearings in the city of Los Angeles that I've worked very closely with my employer, giving them a schedule in advance, knowing that I could produce my staff reports for these standing hearings on Mondays and Tuesdays. So if this motion is passed, I will have to shift my work schedule tremendously on Sunday, Mondays, and Tuesdays, possibly.
Commissioners Dye and then Raya.
I just want to reiterate what Commissioner Blanco mentioned before. I think we need to stop scheduling this around commissioner availability. I think we're all going to miss meetings, and we're just going to have to get over that. As long as we have, we talked before about actually dividing and conquering and just having at least one of each party. And I think, although it would not be ideal, we are working with incredible set of constraints here. And I think if we start getting into everyone's personal work schedule, some people are just going to have to miss certain meetings. And I think that, I'm sensitive what CCP said. If we want to be where the people are, we need to accommodate their schedules, not ours.
Commissioner Raya.
There was another point we brought up in our committee meeting, and that was that we all need to update the schedule, the Google schedule of availability, because that will then help whoever is ultimately scheduling us to be here, there, or wherever, to update it even with I'm not available 9 to 11 a.m. on a given day.
The addition I would add to that is we realized in the last week that it will become increasingly important that we have a calendar where we're able to track not just names of commissioners, but be able to tell at a glance what party each commissioner is affiliated with, so we can tell if we have the right composition for any given meeting or event. So as you will see an example, Christina actually went back into the Google Calendar, and for those of us who had already inputted our availability, added in a little abbreviation regarding which party. So in the future, as you add in your availability, just follow that model because it will become increasingly important. I had a Commissioner Forbes, and then Commissioner Ward, please.
Right. I don't have any major objection to shifting it back to the Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday 4 days. I am personally I'm reluctant to say, because we're trying to come up with a schedule, I'm reluctant to say, well, we're just going to leave it completely open so we can accommodate anything everywhere. I just find that to be very difficult, and I think we need to to me, if you have 4 days a week, out of a week, I think that ought to be enough. It may not be best for everything, but I just think it's very difficult to get, to plan a schedule for the next 3 months for us.
Mm-hmm. Commissioner Ward.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to say I completely agree with what Commissioner Dye is saying. That's just a fact. We have to be flexible and we have to meet the people, and that requires some nimbleness. But what I understood the motion to be was a shift in how we do business from what the commission had previously decided and what the public has probably become used to and understood to be the way we were going to do business. That's why I understood the motion, and that's what my comments were too. But I do agree that nimbleness is required in the 2 months ahead.
So Commissioner Blanco is next up. I do have other commissioners in the stack. I would say, as much as I would have liked to wrap this agenda item up by around this time, I don't think it's going to happen, and I am getting requests that we need a bio break. So after Commissioner Blanco, we will take a break for 5 minutes to run to the restroom, and then we'll be right back and pick up where we left off. Commissioner Blanco.
Whoever's going to hate me now. We have a schedule that, even though we are leaning towards getting away from the educational workshops, the schedule that was presented for April does take into account the surveys that it reflects the preferences by region, because that was already the work done in preparation for this. So if we forget what says education and what says input, these meetings already for the different regions reflect regional preferences for meeting dates. So it seems to me we could add, in keeping with the concept of piggybacking business with input, education, whatever these meetings are that are the general, outreach meetings, to use the more general term, we could still respect the local preferences. And what we're saying is, whether it's Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, we could go with this, but augment it on either side of the weekends. And then where it has the weekdays that were proposed to us, we could work around those, adding a business meeting. So does that make sense? In other words, so I would support the motion of adding the business, concentrating that. But I'm not prepared to say which particular date, that it's always going to be this day or that day, because we've already got in this calendar some work that's been done to tell us that there's other dates for other regions that are better, if that makes any sense.
So again, what I would like to do is to take a bio break. We'll pick up right where we left off in 5 minutes. Thank you. We're now on recess.